Yana Brooks' world shattered the night her father, Samuel, was murdered by his own partner, Edward Blake. For months, Yana lived in a house-turned-prison, watching her mother, Patricia, wither under Edward's psychological terror while he hunted for a $500 million secret vault only Yana could open. When Yana overhears Edward's final order to eliminate her, she flees into the freezing Manhattan rain with nothing but the clothes on her back and a professional assassin on her heels. In a moment of sheer desperation, she dives into a parked limousine, unaware she has just stepped into the mobile fortress of Han Jun-seok, the feared ghost king of the Korean Mafia. Hello, family. Welcome back to Afrosial Mafia Stories, your home for the most intense and emotional tales of justice, betrayal, and unexpected protection. To my incredible subscriber family and all our new viewers, I am so glad you're here to witness this journey. Tonight, we dive into a world where the people you trust most can become your darkest nightmares, and where a stranger from the shadows might just be the one to save your soul. If you're ready to see how Yana Brooks turns the tables on a $500 million betrayal with the help of the Ghost King himself, stay with us until the very end. Your support means the world to me. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of this new legacy. Let's get into the story. The memory of the golden days always felt like a cruel taunt, a shimmering mirage of a life that no longer existed. Before the shadows swallowed the Brooks household, the sun seemed to shine brighter on their estate in the suburbs of New York. It was a time of effortless laughter and expensive scotch, a time when Yana's biggest worry was which college would accept her, and her father, Samuel, was the king of his own mountain. Samuel Brooks was a man built on the pillars of integrity and hard work. He had spent 25 years turning a small logistics firm into a global powerhouse, but he had never forgotten the streets he came from or the people who had walked them with him. Chief among those people was Edward Blake. To Yana, he was simply Uncle Ede, the tall, broad-shouldered man who always arrived at Sunday brunch with a box of expensive pastries and a calculated, charming smile. On that final, fateful afternoon, the air in Samuel's home office was thick with the scent of old books and success. Samuel sat behind his mahogany desk, his face glowing with a pride that wasn't for himself, but for the legacy he was securing. He had just landed the crown jewel, a $500 million government infrastructure contract that would set his family up for generations. "Look at this, Ede," Samuel said, his voice deep and resonant with genuine warmth. He pushed a thick leather-bound folder across the desk. "It's signed, it's done." Edward stood by the window, his expensive charcoal suit catching the afternoon light. He turned slowly, his cold gray eyes scanning the document. He didn't look at the signatures, he looked at the numbers. The zeros seemed to reflect in his pupils like a predator spotting movement in the tall grass. "It's a masterpiece, Sam," Edward replied, his voice smooth and practiced. "A true masterpiece." Samuel stood up and walked around the desk, placing a hand on Edward's shoulder, the hand of a brother, a partner, a man who believed in the sanctity of a 40-year bond. "I know your firm has been struggling, Ede. I haven't been blind to the market shifts. That's why I want you in on this. I'm allocating 40% of the project management to you. It's more than enough to stabilize your company and ensure your retirement is as comfortable as mine." For a moment, the room was silent. Samuel was offering a lifeline, a gift worth $200 million out of nothing but loyalty. But Edward didn't see a lifeline. He saw the remaining 60%. He saw the barrier between him and the full $500 million. To Edward, 40% wasn't an act of grace. It was a lingering insult, a reminder that he would always be the second chair to Samuel's lead. 40%, Edward repeated, his voice devoid of the emotion Samuel expected. He looked down at Samuel's hand on his shoulder as if it were a weight he was finally ready to shake off. "You're a generous man, Sam. Always have been." "We've been through it all, Ede," Samuel said, missing the subtle hardness in Edward's tone. "From the playground to the boardroom, there's no one else I'd rather have by my side for this." Samuel walked over to a crystal decanter and poured 2 glasses of aged bourbon. He handed one to Edward. "To the future," Samuel toasted, his dark brown skin crinkling at the corners of his eyes as he smiled. "To the Brooks and Blake legacy." Edward raised his glass, the amber liquid catching a glint of the setting sun. To the future, he echoed, and to the end of the old ways. They drank, and for Samuel, it was a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. He believed he was saving his friend. He believed he was securing his daughter's future. He had no way of knowing that the man standing 3 feet away, the man who had been the best man at his wedding and the godfather to his child, had already signed his death warrant in his mind. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the office floor, Edward checked his watch. He made a polite excuse about a dinner meeting and gathered his things. At the door, he paused and looked back at Samuel, who was already leaning back in his chair, looking at a framed photo of Yana and Patricia. "Take care of yourself, Sam," Edward said. It wasn't a wish, it was a final goodbye. Samuel waved him off with a grin, oblivious to the fact that Edward was walking straight to his car and picking up a burner phone. While Samuel spent his final evening at home, dancing in the kitchen with Patricia to an old jazz record and telling Yana how proud he was of her, Edward was parked in a dark lot 3 miles away. He sat in the leather-wrapped silence of his own luxury sedan, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the phone's screen. "Is everything in place?" Edward asked when the call was picked up. His voice was no longer the warm, charming tone of Uncle Ede. It was the cold, clinical voice of a man who viewed people as obstacles to be cleared. "The route is confirmed," a gravelly voice responded on the other end. "The accident will happen at the intersection of 5th and Main. High-speed, distracted driver. No survivors." Edward leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. He thought about the 500 million. He thought about the Brooks mansion and how much better he would look in that study than Samuel. He didn't think about the 40 years of shared birthdays, the times Samuel had bylaid him out of debt, or the way Yana used to run to him for hugs when she was a toddler. All of that was noise. All of that was a distraction from the only thing that mattered, the gold. "Make sure the girl and the wife aren't in the car," Edward commanded, though his voice lacked any real concern for their safety. He just knew that killing them now would complicate the legal transfer of the assets he planned to seize. "I need the girl alive to get to the vault. I'll handle the rest of the family later." "Understood," the voice replied. Edward hung up and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. He looked out at the New York skyline, the lights of the city flickering like distant diamonds. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a dark, intoxicating power. For decades, he had lived in Samuel's shadow, the grateful sidekick, the lesser partner. Tonight, that shadow would finally be erased. Back at the mansion, the night was peaceful. Yana sat on the stairs, watching her parents laugh as they cleared the dinner table. She saw the way her father looked at her mother, with a devotion that seemed unbreakable. She saw the man she idolized, a man who believed the world was as honest as he was. "I'm going to head out for a bit, Patricia," Sam said, grabbing his coat. "I promised Sarah I'd drop off those books." "I'll come with you," Patricia offered, reaching for his keys. "No, stay here," he laughed, kissing her cheek. "You've had a long day with the contract. Stay with Yana. I'll be back in an hour." Patricia hesitated, then nodded, sitting back down on the sofa. It was a tiny, inconsequential decision, the kind of choice that usually means nothing. But that night, it changed the trajectory of the Brooks bloodline forever. An hour later, the phone rang. It wasn't Samuel calling to say he was on his way home. It was the police. There had been a horrific accident. A black SUV had been T-boned by a speeding truck that had lost its brakes. Yana watched from the top of the stairs as her mother collapsed onto the floor. The phone slipping from his nerveless fingers. She heard a sound come from her that she would never forget, a hollow, broken wail that signaled the end of their world. She didn't know then that the truck driver was a man Edward Blake had paid $50,000. She didn't know that the accident was a calculated strike designed to break her mother's spirit before Edward broke her neck. And she certainly didn't know that the man who would arrive at their door the next morning, weeping and offering support, was the one who had orchestrated the entire nightmare. The golden days were over. The sun had set on the Brooks family, and in the encroaching darkness, the wolf was already at the door, wearing the skin of a friend. 2 months had passed since the burial of Samuel Brooks, and the mansion that once echoed with jazz and the warmth of a father's laughter had become a tomb of heavy, suffocating silence. The vibrant colors of the upholstery seemed to have faded into a uniform gray, and the air held a stale, metallic chill that no amount of heating could dispel. For Yana, every hallway felt narrower, every door heavier, as if the house itself were slowly shrinking to crush the life out of those left within its walls. The architect of this misery sat at the head of the dining table every night, occupying a seat that did not belong to him. Edward Blake had moved into the Brooks estate under the guise of a grieving protector, a role he played with terrifying precision. To the outside world, he was the noble friend stepping up to stabilize a shattered family. To the neighbors and business associates, he was the hero keeping the Brooks legacy from collapsing. But inside the house, the mask was discarded as soon as the heavy oak doors clicked shut. Yana watched him across the table, her natural braids pulled back tightly, mirroring the tension in her soul. Edward had traded his charming Sunday brunch smiles for a cold, calculating gaze that never truly left her. He didn't use physical chains to keep them there. He used the invisible, far more effective bonds of psychological terror. He had taken control of the household accounts, redirected the mail, and strategically isolated Yana's mother, Patricia. Patricia was a ghost of the woman she had once been. Edward had placed her under medical supervision, claiming her grief was too profound for her to handle the daily stresses of life. Yana rarely saw her mother outside of her bedroom, and when she did, Patricia's kind, expressive eyes were clouded, her posture defeated. Edward was slowly gaslighting her, whispering that she was unstable, that she was lucky he was there to save her from her own mind. It was a slow-motion execution of a woman's spirit, and Yana was forced to watch it happen, powerless and penniless. "You aren't eating, Yana," Edward said one evening, his fork scraping against the fine china with a sound like a blade on bone. He looked at her with those cold gray eyes, a subtle hardness lurking behind his polished exterior. "Your mother is worried about you. We both are. It's important that we stay healthy as we move forward with the transition of your father's assets." Yana didn't blink. She knew what transition meant. It meant the total absorption of the $500 million contract and the erasure of her father's name. "My mother hasn't spoken in 3 days, Edward," she said, her voice a quiet but steady flame. "The only person worried here is you, worried that you haven't found what you're looking for yet." Edward's expression didn't change, but the air in the room seemed to drop several degrees. He leaned forward, the light catching the strands of gray at his temples. "I am trying to protect this family's future. Your father left behind a complicated web of finances. There are certain gaps in the records, gaps that only a daughter who is close to her father might be able to fill." He was hunting. Yana knew it. For weeks, she had heard him packing in her father's study late at night. She had heard the sound of furniture being moved, of floorboards being pried, and of Edward's muffled curses when he found nothing. He knew Samuel had a secret vault, a private emergency fund, or a digital ledger of the contract's true power, but he couldn't find the entrance. "I don't know anything about his business, Uncle Ede," Yana lied, using the old name like a bitter tonic. "I was just his daughter." Edward smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who knew he could wait. He had all the time in the world, and he had Patricia as his leverage. "Of course. Go to your room, Yana. Sleep. Tomorrow is a long day." Yana retreated, but she didn't go to her room. She waited until the house was utterly still, until the rhythmic, heavy snores of Edward's personal guard echoed from the downstairs hallway. She moved through the shadows of the mansion with the practiced ease of someone who had spent her childhood playing hide-and-seek in these very corridors. She reached the study, the heavy double doors groaning slightly as she slipped inside. The room smelled of Edward's expensive cigars and the lingering, faint scent of her father's sandalwood cologne. It was a battlefield of greed. Books were shoved haphazardly back onto shelves, and the rug had been tossed aside. Edward had looked everywhere, the safe in the floor, the hollowed-out books, the desk drawers. He had looked with the eyes of a thief, searching for a lock to pick. Yana walked to the large family portrait that hung on the far wall. It was a painting of the three of them, Samuel, Patricia, and a teenage Yana, taken in the summer of 2005. Her father looked so strong, his eyes reflecting the wisdom and kindness that Edward could never understand. Yana reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the painted silver locket her mother wore in the portrait. She didn't push, she didn't pull. She placed her thumb against a small, almost invisible indentation in the frame, right where her father's hand rested on her shoulder. A faint, electronic hum filled the room, so soft it was almost a vibration. Behind the canvas, a small biometric panel slid open, glowing with a soft, blue light. It was a high-frequency scanner, a piece of technology far beyond anything Edward had brought into the house. Yana leaned in, allowing the scanner to map her retina. With a hiss of compressed air, a section of the oak paneling beside the portrait clicked and retreated, revealing a narrow, hidden chamber. Yana's breath hitched. Inside wasn't a mountain of gold or stacks of cash. Instead, there was a sleek silver console and a series of encrypted drives. On the center of the console sat a small, handwritten note in her father's unmistakable, elegant script. For Yana, when the world shows you its teeth, remember that you are a Brooks. This is your shield. She realized then that this vault was the only thing keeping them alive. As long as Edward didn't have the code, as long as he couldn't access the 500 million, he had to keep them in the house. The moment he cracked the vault, Yana and her mother would become loose ends that needed to be cut. She stared at the glowing console, the weight of the secret pressing down on her petite frame. She was 21 years old, trapped in a house with a murderer, guarding a fortune that felt like a death sentence. She wasn't just a daughter anymore, she was the keeper of the keys. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. Yana's heart hammered against her ribs. She slammed the biometric panel shut, the oak wood sliding back into place with a seamless click just as the door handle turned. She scrambled to the window, pulling the heavy velvet curtains around her, making herself as small as possible. The door swung open, and the silhouette of Edward Blake stood in the frame. He didn't turn on the light. He simply stood there in the darkness, staring at the family portrait as if he could force it to give up its secrets through sheer will. He stayed for what felt like an eternity, the tip of his cigar glowing like a vengeful eye in the dark. "I know you're in here somewhere, Sam," Edward whispered to the empty air, his voice thick with a twisted, obsessive envy. "And I know she knows. I'll make her talk. One way or another, I'll take what's mine." When he finally left, Yana stayed behind the curtain for a long time, her wide eyes fixed on the portrait. The silence of the house was no longer just a burden, it was a warning. The caring act was over. Edward was losing his patience, and the sanctuary of the silent house was about to become a slaughterhouse. She had found the shield, but she knew she didn't have much time before the wolf figured out how to break it. The following night, the air in the Brooks mansion felt thicker, as if the oxygen were being slowly pumped out of the rooms. Yana moved through the upstairs corridor with the ghost-like silence of the hunted, her feet barely touching the plush carpet. She had spent the last 24 hours in a state of hypervigilance, every nerve ending frayed by the memory of the biometric vault and the hunger in Edward's eyes. She needed to check on her mother one last time before finding a way to smuggle a message out of the house. But as she passed the heavy oak doors of the study, a low, clinical murmur stopped her cold. Edward was not packing tonight. He was seated, his voice carrying that terrifying, calm authority he used when the mask was completely discarded. Yana pressed her back against the cold wallpaper, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she feared the sound might betray her. Through the narrow gap in the double doors, she could see the glow of a single desk lamp and the broad, intimidating silhouette of Edward's lead guard, a man whose only loyalty was to the highest bidder. "I've been patient, Marcus," Edward said, and the sound of his voice made Yana's skin crawl. "I've played the grieving friend. I've played the concerned stepfather. But the girl is a brick wall. She looks at me like she's already buried me, and quite frankly, the theatrics are becoming expensive." There was a brief silence, followed by the sound of a glass being set down on the mahogany desk, the same desk where her father had once toasted to 40 years of friendship. "She knows where it is," Edward continued, his tone dropping into something darker, something final. "But she's never going to give it up. Not to me. And as long as she's breathing, she's a tether to the past that I can't afford to keep. If she won't talk, she is officially useless." "And the mother?" Marcus's voice was a rough, emotionless rasp. "Patricia is already halfway to the grave. She won't even realize the girl is gone. We'll tell her Yana ran away in her grief. Then in a few weeks, Patricia will succumb to her broken heart. It's cleaner this way." Edward sighed, a sound of genuine relief. "Eliminate the girl tonight. Make it look like a tragic accident on the streets, a robbery gone wrong. Just make sure she's dead before the sun comes up. I want that vault opened by Monday, with or without her eyes." Yana felt the world tilt beneath her feet. The metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth, sharp and cold. She wasn't just a prisoner anymore. She was a countdown. She didn't wait to hear Marcus's response. She turned and drifted back toward her bedroom, her movements fueled by a sudden, primal surge of adrenaline that overrode the trembling in her limbs. Inside her room, she didn't turn on the light. She grabbed her gray hoodie from the chair and pulled it over her braids, her fingers fumbling with the drawstring. She had no time for a suitcase, no time for sentimental items. She reached under her mattress and pulled out the small, encrypted drive she had dared to take from the vault the night before. It was the only weapon she had, even if she didn't know how to fire it. She heard the heavy, rhythmic click of boots on the stairs. They were coming. She didn't have seconds. She had heartbeats. Yana rushed to the tall, Victorian window that looked out over the back gardens and the sprawling New York skyline beyond. She unlatched the heavy frame, the wood groaning in a way that sounded like a scream in the silence of the house. The freezing November rain lashed inside immediately, soaking her face and hair, but she didn't flinch. Across the room, the door handle began to turn. Yana scrambled onto the ledge, her sneakers slipping on the wet stone. She didn't look down at the 20-foot drop to the manicured lawn below. She looked at the shadows of the trees at the edge of the estate. Behind her, the bedroom door flew open, hitting the wall with a deafening crack. "Yana," Marcus's voice boomed, no longer trying to hide his intent. She didn't look back. She let go of the frame and dropped into the darkness. The impact jarred her entire body, a shock of pain radiating through her ankles and up her spine. But she was already rolling, moving, pushing herself up from the mud. She heard a shout from the window above and the flash of a tactical light cutting through the rain, searching for her petite form. "She's out," someone yelled. Yana bolted. She sprinted toward the iron gates at the rear of the property, her lungs burning as the freezing air tore at her throat. She could hear the screech of tires from the front of the house. Edward's men were mobilizing the SUVs to cut her off. She climbed the gate with a frantic, desperate strength she didn't know she possessed, the sharp metal catching the sleeve of her hoodie, tearing the fabric as she threw herself over the top. She hit the pavement of the public street and didn't stop. She ran blindly, her expressive eyes wide with terror, her mind a chaotic loop of Edward's words. Eliminate her tonight. Every shadow looked like a hitman, every headlight looked like a searchlight. She ducked into an alleyway, her feet splashing through deep puddles, her breath coming in thin white clouds that vanished in the rain. She could hear the roar of a powerful engine behind her, the high-pitched whine of a luxury SUV being pushed to its limits. They were tracking her. Edward had the city in his pocket. There was nowhere she could go where his reach wouldn't find her. She burst out of the alleyway onto a slightly busier street, her eyes searching for a crowd, a police car, anything. Instead, she saw the obsidian-black limousine idling at a red light. It was a fortress on wheels, its tinted windows reflecting the neon glow of the city like the eyes of a deep-sea predator. To anyone else, it was a symbol of unattainable wealth. To Yana, it was a hiding spot. With the SUV turning the corner just a block away, she lunged for the rear door handle. To her shock, the lock clicked. She scrambled inside, collapsing onto the floorboards and pulling the door shut just as the headlights of her pursuers swept across the street, missing her by a fraction of a second. She huddled in the darkness of the plush interior, her knees pulled tight to her chest, her hands locked around her shins. She was shivering so violently her teeth rattled. She waited for the car to move, for the driver to realize she was there and throw her back out to the wolves. But the car remained still. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaos of the rain outside. Then she heard it, the soft, mechanical click of the child locks engaging, and then the even softer sound of someone shifting in the seat above her. Yana looked up, her vision blurred by tears and rain. In the dim amber glow of the cabin's accent lights, she saw him. A man in a tailored black suit, his posture radiating a quiet, lethal authority. He didn't look like a businessman, and he certainly didn't look like a friend. He looked like the end of the world. He didn't speak. He simply reached down and tilted the barrel of a suppressed pistol toward her, the cold steel reflecting the fear in her eyes. Yana stared at the tattoo on his neck, her breath hitching. She had escaped the assassin's blade only to find herself at the feet of a king. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. "Please don't let them take me." The man, Han Junseok, didn't pull the trigger. He watched her, his dark eyes calculating and intense, as if he were reading the story written in her bruises and her desperate, wide-eyed stare. Outside, the black SUV slowed down, its headlights lingering on the limousine for a moment before moving on. Junseok looked from the window back to the girl shivering on his floor. He lowered the gun, the click of the safety echoing in the small space. "Drive," he commanded the unseen driver through the intercom. The limousine pulled away from the curb, gliding into the Manhattan night. Yana closed her eyes, the adrenaline finally ebbing away, leaving only the crushing weight of her reality. She was safe from Edward, but as the Ghost King watched her from the shadows of the leather seat, she knew her life would never be the same. She had jumped into the fire, and only time would tell if she would burn or be forged anew. The limousine glided through the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan like a silent phantom, the city lights blurring into long, neon streaks against the tinted glass. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with a different kind of tension than the one Yana had just fled. It wasn't the chaotic, drunken rage of Edward's world. It was a cold, structured power that commanded the very air she breathed. Yana remained huddled on the floorboards, her petite frame still trembling, her wide eyes fixed on the man who sat above her in the shadows. Han Junseok did not look at her with the predatory hunger she had grown to expect from men in power. He didn't look at her as a piece of property or a loose end to be snipped. Instead, his gaze was clinical and observant, settling on the tear in her hoodie and the faint, darkening bruise on her jaw where Marcus's hand had grazed her during the struggle at the mansion. He tapped a button on the console, and the partition between the driver and the passenger cabin slid shut with a near-silent hiss. "You can get off the floor," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that held the weight of a decree. "The locks on this car are reinforced. No one is coming inside." Yana hesitated, then slowly pulled herself onto the leather seat, keeping as much distance between them as the cabin allowed. She felt the car turn, beginning a steep ascent into a private parking garage. Minutes later, the door was opened by a man in a tactical suit who stood with his head bowed in deference. Junseok stepped out and gestured for her to follow. They ascended in a private elevator that moved with such speed it made Yana's ears pop. When the doors opened, she found herself in a penthouse that felt less like a home and more like a fortress of glass and steel. The space was minimalist and vast, overlooking the sprawling sprawl of New York, yet the windows were clearly made of glass thick enough to stop a high-caliber round. "Sit," Junseok commanded, gesturing toward a large charcoal-gray sofa. Yana sat, her hands locked tightly around her knees. She watched as Junseok removed his suit jacket, revealing the lean, athletic build of a man who spent as much time training as he did in the boardroom. The tattoo on his neck, a dark, intricate design of a dragon coiling toward his ear, seemed to pulse in the dim light of the penthouse. He walked to a side table and poured a glass of water, placing it on the table in front of her. "Who is chasing you?" he asked, leaning against the kitchen island, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "My stepfather," Yana whispered, her voice cracking. "Edward Blake, he killed my father for a contract, and now he wants to kill me because I won't give him the code to the vault." The mention of Edward Blake caused a flicker of something dark to pass through Junseok's expression. He didn't seem surprised by the name, but rather disgusted by the context. He walked closer, stopping just a few feet away, observing the quiet resilience that managed to shine through her terror. In her almond-shaped eyes, he saw a reflection of a ghost he had buried long ago, the look of someone who had been betrayed by the very person who was supposed to protect them. Junseok remembered the day his own blood had turned against him in the streets of Seoul, leaving him for dead to seize a throne they hadn't earned. He knew the specific, hollow ache of a broken bond. To Junseok, power was a tool of order, but betrayal was a stain on a man's soul that could only be washed away with iron. "Edward Blake is a businessman who plays at being a wolf," Junseok said, his voice dropping an octave. In my world, a man who murders his brother for gold is not a wolf. He is a parasite, and I have a very low tolerance for parasites. Yana looked up at him, sensing a shift in the air. This man was dangerous. Danger was written into the very lines of his face, but it was a structured danger. He had a code. He didn't operate on greed. He operated on a ruthless sense of justice that she had never encountered in the polished, lying circles of her father's former associates. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jun Seok walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city he partially owned. "I don't help people, Yana. I maintain the balance. Your stepfather broke the rules of the game. He brought his filth into my city, and he thought he could hunt a child in the dark without consequence." He turned back to her, his sharp facial features illuminated by the city lights behind him. For a moment, he looked like the ghost king the legends spoke of, a man who stood between the light and the dark. "You are safe here," he said, and the finality of his tone acted like a physical shield around her. "My men are stationed at every entrance. The technology in this building can track a heartbeat from 3 blocks away. From this moment on, you are off-limits to Edward Blake. You are off-limits to the world." Yana felt a sob catch in her throat, not of fear, but of an overwhelming, soul-deep relief. For 2 months, she had been a hunted animal, sleeping with one eye open, waiting for the floorboards to creak. Now, in the heart of the most dangerous man in New York's sanctuary, she finally felt the weight of the hunt lift. Jun Seok watched her, noticing the way her tense shoulders finally began to drop. He signaled to one of his house staff, a silent woman who appeared from a side room. "Show Miss Brooks to the guest wing. See that she has whatever she needs. And tell Vincent to double the perimeter. If so much as a shadow moves toward this building without my clearance, they are to be neutralized." As Anna stood up to follow the woman, she paused and looked back at Jun Seok. He was already pulling a phone from his pocket, his mind already moving toward the tactical dismantling of Edward's world. "Thank you," she said softly. Jun Seok didn't look up, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Sleep, Yana. Tomorrow, we begin the process of taking back what belongs to you. In my house, the prey becomes the hunter." As Anna walked down the long, silent corridor of the guest wing, she realized she had traded one master for another. But as she looked at the reinforced steel of the door and the calm, disciplined eyes of the guards in the hall, she knew she had finally found the one thing Edward could never buy: a protector who valued honor more than the $500 million that had started this bloodbath. The sanctuary of the Ghost King was now her home, and for the first time since her father's death, the darkness outside the window didn't seem so cold. The first rays of dawn were beginning to bleed over the Manhattan skyline, casting a cold, blue light into the vast expanse of the penthouse, when Anna found Han Jun Seok standing in the kitchen. He was dressed in a fresh white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were a map of scars and strength. He was focused on the simple task of brewing coffee, but the way he moved, with a quiet, coiled energy, remained a constant reminder of the world he commanded. He didn't turn when she entered, yet he spoke as if he had been watching her through the walls. "The doctor says you have a minor concussion and several bruised ribs," Jun Seok said, his voice as steady as the morning tide. "But you are alive. That is a start most of my enemies don't get." Yana sat at the marble island, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. The fear that had defined her existence for months was still there, but it had shifted from a frantic, screaming thing to a dull, cold weight. She looked at the man across from her, a man who lived in the shadows of the law, and she realized that the truth was the only currency she had left to pay for her protection. "It wasn't an accident," Yana began, her voice gaining a resonance it hadn't held the night before. "The crash that killed my father, and my mother's illness that followed. Edward Blake didn't just stumble into our lives after the funeral. He orchestrated the end of it." Jun Seok set a cup down and leaned against the counter, his dark eyes narrowing. He listened in a silence so profound it seemed to pull the words from her. Yana told him everything: the $500 million government contract, the 40% stake her father had offered out of a misplaced sense of loyalty, and the way Edward's greed had mutated that gift into a motive for murder. She described the biometric vault hidden behind the family portrait, the secret shield her father had built for a day he hoped would never come. "He's keeping my mother hostage because he knows I'm the only one who can open it," she whispered, her almond-shaped eyes shimmering with a mix of grief and fury. "He killed his best friend, his brother, for money he didn't even earn. He's tearing my father's legacy apart, piece by piece, just to see what's inside." As Anna spoke, she watched Junseok's physical transformation. His posture didn't change, but the air around him seemed to thicken with a palpable, vibrating heat. His jaw tightened, the muscles corded and hard, and his eyes turned into chips of black flint. In the underworld Junseok ruled, there were many sins: theft, violence, even deception. But the betrayal of a brother, of a man who had shared your bread and offered you his hand in your weakest moment, was the ultimate transgression. It was the one crime that demanded a total and scorched-earth response. 40 years, Junseok murmured, more to himself than to her. He gave him 40 years of trust, and Blake sold it for a contract. He turned away from her, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He looked down at the streets below, where the morning traffic was beginning to crawl, thousands of people moving through their lives unaware of the war that was about to be declared in the clouds above them. Junseok had lived his life by a rigid, ancient code of blood and honor. To him, Edward Blake wasn't just a criminal. He was a rot in the system, a man who had spat on the very concept of loyalty. "In my world," Junseok said, his voice now a low, dangerous growl, "we have a word for men who kill their brothers for gold. We call them ghosts, because by the time we are finished with them, there is nothing left but the memory of their failure." He pulled a black smartphone from his pocket and tapped a single command. Within seconds, the elevator chimed, and Vincent, Junseok's primary lieutenant, stepped out. Vincent was a man of few words and absolute efficiency, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He stood at attention, waiting for the word that would change the landscape of the New York underworld. "Edward Blake," Junseok said, not looking back. "I want his accounts flagged. I want his guards identified and their families located. I want to know every politician he's bribed and every judge he has in his pocket. If he breathes, I want to know the volume of the air he takes in." "And the estate, sir?" Vincent asked. "Surround it," Junseok commanded. "But do not strike yet. He has the mother. We don't move until we can guarantee her safety. But I want him to feel the walls closing in. I want him to look at the shadows and see my face." He turned back to Ayanna, who was watching him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. She saw the mobilization of an empire, a silent, deadly machinery that was being redirected entirely toward her salvation. Junseok wasn't just offering her a place to hide, he was offering her an army. "The secret you are guarding is your father's final gift," Junseok told her, walking back to the island. "Edward thinks that money is his prize. He doesn't realize it's the bait that brought him into my sight. He broke the rules of the streets, Ayanna, and the streets are coming for him." He reached out, and for the first time he touched her, a brief, grounding hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, but a seal of protection. "Rest today," he said. "The Mafia is moving. By tonight, Edward Blake will realize that the $500 million he killed for is the most expensive mistake of his life. We are not going to court, Ayanna. We are going to war." As Vincent disappeared back into the elevator to execute the orders, the penthouse returned to its hushed, reinforced silence. But the energy had shifted. The sanctuary of the Ghost King was no longer a place of passive waiting. It was a war room. Ayanna looked at the biometric drive sitting on the table, then back at Junseok. She realized that while her father had built her a shield, this man was going to be her sword. The secret of the vault was safe, and for the first time since the night of the crash, the shadows didn't feel like they were coming for her. They felt like they were standing behind her, waiting for the command to strike. If you're rooting for Ayanna and Junseok to take down Edward and reclaim the Brooks legacy, show some love by hitting that like button right now. It helps our subscriber family grow and keeps these stories alive. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the moment justice is served. Now, let's get back to the final showdown. The transition from the fortified penthouse to the safe house was a masterclass in tactical deception. Han Junseok did not believe in stationary targets. He believed in fluid shadows. Under the cover of a moonless Manhattan night, Anna had been moved in a nondescript sedan, not the obsidian limousine, to a brownstone in Brooklyn that appeared, from the outside, to be nothing more than a crumbling relic of the 19th century. Inside, however, it was a nerve center of high-frequency sensors and reinforced steel. Anna sat in the dim light of the kitchen, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain cup. The silence of the safe house was different from the silence of her father's mansion. It didn't feel like a tomb. It felt like a coiled spring. Vincent stood by the window, his silhouette motionless, his eyes fixed on a tablet that displayed a dozen different thermal feeds of the street outside. He was waiting for a ghost, and in the world of the Korean Mafia, ghosts were the easiest prey to catch. Edward's assassin, a man known in the darker corners of the city as the Broker, was a professional who prided himself on his patience. He had tracked the girl through a series of digital breadcrumbs and physical sightings that Jun Seok had meticulously left behind. The Broker believed he had found the weak link in the Ghost King's armor. He had watched the brownstone for 3 hours, noting the lack of visible guards and the flickering light in the kitchen window. To a man who dealt in death, it looked like an oversight. It looked like an opportunity. At 3:14 a.m., the back garden gate of the brownstone groaned, a sound designed to be heard only by those listening for it. The Broker moved with the grace of a predator, his dark tactical gear blending into the shadows of the overgrown ivy. He scaled the rear porch, his gloved hands finding grip on the ancient wood with silent precision. He reached the second-story window, the one he had identified as the girl's bedroom, and produced a diamond-tipped glass cutter. Inside the house, Anna didn't hear a sound. She didn't see the thermal bloom on Vincent's tablet or the silent hand signals he gave to the 2 elite guards stationed in the crawlspace above the ceiling. She only felt a sudden, inexplicable change in the air, a shift in the house's pressure. The Broker stepped through the window, his suppressed pistol raised, his eyes scanning the bed for the petite form of Anna Brooks. But the bed was empty, the pillows arranged to mimic the shape of a sleeping body. Before the realization could even register in his mind, the darkness of the room came alive. It wasn't a firefight, it was a surgical removal. A high-intensity flashbang erupted from the corner of the room, a silent white light that stripped the assassin of his vision and balance. In the split second of his disorientation, 2 shadows dropped from the ceiling. There was no shouting, no ego, only the clinical efficiency of Jun Seok's elite. One guard caught the assassin's wrist, twisting the pistol away with a sickening crack of bone, while the second delivered a precise, paralyzing strike to the nerve cluster at the base of his neck. The Broker hit the floor without a sound, his body rendered useless before he could even process that he had been compromised. By the time Anna reached the doorway, drawn by the muffled thud of the struggle, the room was already being cleared. The assassin was being zipped into a heavy nylon transport bag, his weapons catalogued, and the window he had broken already being boarded up by a third man who had appeared from the hallway shadows. Vincent stepped into the room, his expression as neutral as a slab of granite. He looked at Anna, who was staring at the spot where the man who had been sent to kill her had just been neutralized. Her almond-shaped eyes were wide, but the terror that had once paralyzed her was being replaced by a cold, hard realization. Edward's reach had hit a wall it could not break. "He's gone," Vincent said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "He won't be reporting back to Mr. Blake." "Is it over?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling but not breaking. "For the hunter, yes," Vincent replied. He looked toward the door as Han Jun Seok stepped into the room. Jun Seok didn't look at the assassin being carried out. He walked straight to Anna, his presence filling the small bedroom, his sharp facial features illuminated by the tactical lights of his men. He saw the way she looked at the empty bed, the place where she was supposed to have died. He saw the strength returning to her posture, the way she was finally beginning to believe in the sanctuary he had built around her. "The Broker was the best Edward could buy," Jun Seok said, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "And the best he could buy was not enough to step foot in my house. Do you understand now, Anna? You are no longer a victim waiting for a blow. You are the center of a fortress." He reached out and tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. "Edward is currently waiting for a phone call that will never come. Every hour that passes without word is a nail in his coffin. He is panicked. He is making mistakes. And while he waits in the dark, we are moving into the light." Yana took a breath, the cold Manhattan air finally feeling clean. The man who had chased her through the rain, the man who had held her mother hostage, the man who had turned her home into a prison, he was finally losing. She wasn't just safe. She was protected by a force that operated on a level of power Edward couldn't even fathom. "I want my mother back," she said, her voice now a firm, determined command. Junseok gave a small, chilling smile, the smile of a man who had already seen the end of the war. "The mobilization is complete, Yana. The strike team is in position at the Brooks estate. We don't wait for Edward to find us anymore. Tonight, we bring the storm to his front door." As the guards finished sanitizing the room, Yana realized the shift was total. The silent house was about to be silent no more. The Ghost King had proven his point. In his world, the hunter didn't just fail, he vanished. And as she followed Junseok out of the safe house toward the waiting cars, she knew the next time she saw Edward Blake, it wouldn't be from the floorboards of a car. It would be from the throne he had tried to steal. The black command vehicle was a masterpiece of mobile surveillance, parked in a shadowed alleyway 3 blocks from the Brooks estate. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the low-frequency hum of high-end electronics. Yana sat in the center of the hub, her almond-shaped eyes fixed on a wall of monitors that displayed a dozen different angles of her childhood home. For 2 months, this house had been her prison. Now, it was a target. Beside her, Vincent sat with his hands hovering over a tactical keyboard, while Han Junseok stood at the van's exit, checking the slide on his weapon with a cold, rhythmic precision. "We have visual on the target," Vincent said, his voice flat. "Edward is in the library. Your mother is in her bedroom on the 2nd floor, south wing. 2 guards are stationed at her door and 4 more are patrolling the perimeter. They're armed with semi-automatics, but their posture is sloppy. They aren't expecting a war." Junseok looked at Yana. The blue light from the monitors reflected in his dark eyes, making him look like a vengeful deity carved from obsidian. He saw the way her hands were balled into fists in her lap, her knuckles white. She wasn't just watching a rescue, she was watching the systematic dismantling of the man who had stolen her world. "The objective is the mother," Junseok said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Everything else is secondary. If Edward tries to use her as a shield, the perimeter team has orders to take the shot. Yana, keep your eyes on the feed. I want you to see the moment he realizes he is no longer the master of this house." Without another word, Junseok stepped out of the van and vanished into the night. Yana leaned forward, her breath hitching as she watched the thermal cameras pick up the movement of Junseok's elite tactical team. They moved through the manicured gardens like liquid shadows, bypassing the infrared sensors Edward had installed with a technical ease that was terrifying. On the monitors, the rescue mission unfolded with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a surgical strike. The 4 perimeter guards never even had a chance to raise their weapons. One moment they were packing the stone walkways, the glow of their cigarettes visible on the night vision feed. The next, they were pulled into the bushes by shadows that moved faster than the eye could track. There were no gunshots, no shouts, only the muffled thuds of bodies hitting the grass and the clinical click of zip ties being tightened. Yana watched the camera feed in her mother's hallway. 2 of Edward's men stood outside Patricia's door, leaning against the mahogany frames and laughing at something on a phone. They were the men who had mocked her mother's grief and held the door shut while Patricia wept. Suddenly, the ceiling panels above them exploded downward. Junseok's men dropped from the crawl space like black-clad spirits. The guards were neutralized in less than 5 seconds. One held in a chokelock that cut off his breath before he could scream. The other slammed against the wall with such force that he crumpled instantly. The door to the bedroom swung open. Junseok stepped into the frame, his sharp facial features illuminated by the hallway light. Yana gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she saw her mother on the screen. Patricia was sitting by the window, her slender figure looking fragile and small in a modest nightgown. She looked terrified, her kind eyes wide with the belief that Edward had finally come to finish what he started. But Junseok did something Yana hadn't expected. He lowered his weapon, his posture shifting from a soldier to a protector. He knelt in front of Patricia, his voice likely a calm, steady murmur that Yana couldn't hear through the silent feed. He reached out and took Patricia's hand with a gentleness that was at odds with the tattoo on his neck and the blood on his knuckles. After a heartbeat of hesitation, Patricia's shoulders slumped, and she leaned into him, her face buried in her hands as the first sobs of her true freedom broke through her catatonic state. "She's secure," Vincent announced, his fingers flying across the keys. "Extracting target to the secondary vehicle now." Yana watched as her mother was shielded by a circle of tactical guards and led out of the room. But Jun Seok didn't follow them. Instead, he turned and walked toward the library. The camera in the library showed Edward Blake sitting behind Samuel's desk, a glass of bourbon in his hand, looking at the family portrait with a frustrated, greedy glare. He was still waiting for the phone call from his hitman. He was so focused on his own ambition that he didn't hear the library doors open. He didn't realize he wasn't alone until the light from the hallway cast a long, sharp shadow across the mahogany desk. Edward jumped to his feet, the bourbon splashing over the $500 million contract. "Who the hell are you?" "Marcus, get in here." Jun Seok walked into the room with a terrifying, slow gait. He didn't raise his gun. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence seemed to shrink the room around Edward. "Marcus isn't coming, Edward. And neither is the man you sent to kill Ayanna. You've been playing at being a king in a house built on a brother's blood. But the king of New York doesn't like competition from parasites." Yana watched Edward's face on the monitor. The polished, intimidating mask of the stepfather shattered into 1,000 pieces of jagged, pathetic fear. His skin turned an ashen gray, and his hands began to shake as he looked into Jun Seok's eyes. He realized in that moment that he hadn't just lost the girl or the money. He had invited a demon into his living room. I can explain," Edward stammered, backing away until he hit the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It was just business. Samuel was weak. I was saving the legacy." Jun Seok stopped inches from him, his voice a low hiss that Yana felt even through the glass of the monitor. "You didn't save a legacy. You stole a name. And tonight, I'm taking it back." Jun Seok reached out and grabbed Edward by the collar of his expensive business suit, dragging him toward the center of the room. He didn't kill him. That would have been too easy. Instead, he leaned in and whispered something into Edward's ear that made the older man's eyes bulge in terror. Jun Seok then threw him to the floor like a piece of discarded trash. "Vincent," Jun Seok said into his comms, looking directly into the security camera as if he knew Yana was watching. "Burn the digital perimeter. Leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that I am watching his every breath. We leave when the mother is safe." As the tactical teams began to withdraw, the command van door opened, and Anna's mother was helped inside. Anna didn't wait. She threw herself into her mother's arms, the scent of Patricia's familiar perfume finally replacing the smell of rain and fear. They held each other in the dim light of the van, two survivors of a nightmare that had lasted far too long. A minute later, Jun Seok climbed into the van. He looked at the two women, the girl who had jumped into his car in a rainstorm, and the mother he had just pulled from the brink of a broken heart. He saw the strength in Ayanna's gaze, a quiet resilience that had been forged in the fire of the last hour. "The house is yours again, Ayanna," Jun Seok said, though he didn't look at the monitors. "But Edward is a cornered rat. He will try to run. He thinks he has one more card to play with the vault keys he took from your father's desk." Yana looked at him, her dark brown skin glowing in the light of the surveillance screens. "Let him run. He has nowhere to go where you can't find him." Jun Seok gave a small, chilling smile, the smile of a man who was already looking forward to the hunt. "Exactly. We've rescued the mother. Now we finish the businessman." The command van pulled away from the Brooks estate, leaving Edward Blake screaming in the middle of a silent, empty library. The rescue mission was over, but the war for justice had one final, high-speed chapter left to write. And as Anna held her mother's hand, she knew that with the Ghost King by her side, the ending would be written in the blood of the man who had dared to break her family. The predator was finally out of shadows and into the blinding light of his own consequences. As the command van pulled away with Yana and her mother safely cocooned in its armored walls, the monitors behind them showed Edward Blake scrambling from the ruins of the library. He was clutching a heavy brass ring of keys, the master set he had stolen from Samuel's desk, as if they were a holy relic that could still save him. He didn't realize that in Han Jun Seok's world, there were no keys to a door that had already been welded shut. The night air screamed with the roar of a high-performance engine as Junseok traded the luxury of the van for a matte black Ducati. He didn't wear a helmet. His dark eyes were fixed on the taillights of Edward's silver Mercedes as it tore down the driveway of the Brooks estate, kicking up gravel like a wounded beast. Junseok kicked the bike into gear, the machine beneath him growling with a lethal mechanical hunger. He wasn't just a man on a motorcycle. He was the physical manifestation of the justice Samuel Brooks had been denied. The chase hit the West Side Highway at a speed that blurred the city's skyline into a streaking mess of steel and neon. Edward was driving with the frantic, uncoordinated energy of a man who knew he was being hunted by something he couldn't outrun. He glanced in his rearview mirror, his face a mask of sweating, wide-eyed terror as he saw the single, piercing lead headlight of the Ducati closing the gap with terrifying ease. Every time Edward swerved through traffic, the bike followed, leaning into the turns with the grace of a predator. Inside the command van, Ayanna watched the GPS tracking and the live feed from Junseok's helmet camera. She saw the needle on Edward's speedometer climb, 90, 100, 110. He was a man driven by a singular, toxic greed, still holding those keys in one hand while he white-knuckled the steering wheel with the other. He thought if he could just reach the private airfield, if he could just get to the offshore accounts, he would win. He didn't understand that the Ghost King didn't care about the money. He only cared about the debt. Junseok pulled alongside the Mercedes, the wind whipping his jet-black hair back from his sharp facial features. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply looked at Edward through the glass, his expression one of absolute, chilling calm. He wanted Edward to see the man who was ending his reign. He wanted him to feel the weight of every lie he had told and every drop of blood he had spilled. Panic, sharp and blinding, finally shattered what was left of Edward's composure. He looked at Junseok, saw the dark tattoo on his neck and the absence of mercy in his eyes, and he made his final, fatal mistake. Thinking he could ram the bike off the road, Edward yanked the wheel hard to the left. But Junseok was already moving, his reflexes honed in a world where a millisecond was the difference between life and death. He braked hard, the Ducati's tires screaming against the asphalt as the bike dropped back. Edward's Mercedes, now out of control and traveling at over 100 miles per hour, skipped across the median. The silver car drifted into the oncoming lanes just as a massive industrial freighter truck rounded the bend. The driver of the truck had no time to brake. The impact was a thundering, bone-shaking crescendo of screeching metal and shattering glass. Ayanna watched the monitor as her father's murderer was consumed by the very chaos he had spent his life orchestrating. The Mercedes was crumpled like a soda can, sent spinning into the concrete barrier in a violent spray of sparks. A second later, the fuel tank ignited. A pillar of orange and red fire erupted into the Manhattan night, lighting up the highway like a funeral pyre. The brass keys Edward had died protecting flew from the wreckage, skittering across the pavement before being melted into nothingness by the heat of the blast. Junseok brought the Ducati to a controlled stop 100 yards away. He sat on the idling bike, the flickering orange light of the fire dancing in his dark eyes. He didn't look triumphant, he looked finished. The debt had been paid in full, and the man who had turned a brother's love into a death sentence was now nothing but ash and twisted steel. Inside the van, Ayanna felt a strange, hollow peace settle over her. The stepfather was gone. The man who had made her mother a ghost and her home a prison had vanished in a flash of fire. She looked at her mother, who was staring at the small screen with a single tear tracking down her dark skin. They were no longer the hunted. Junseok turned his bike around, the roar of the engine echoing off the highway walls as he headed back toward the van. The chase was over. Justice had been served at 100 miles per hour, and as the sirens of the approaching police cars began to wail in the distance, Ayanna knew that the legacy of Samuel Brooks was finally safe. The wolf was dead, and the Ghost King was coming home. The silence that settled over the Brooks estate the following morning was finally the right kind of quiet. It wasn't the suffocating, fearful hush of Edward's reign, but the peaceful stillness of a house that had been purged of its rot. Sunlight streamed through the tall library windows, dancing on the mahogany desk that had been scrubbed clean of Edward's presence. Ayanna stood in the center of the room, her hand resting on her mother's shoulder. Patricia looked stronger. her elegant features regaining their light now that the shadow of her captor had been incinerated on a distant highway. Han Junseok stood by the double doors, his presence as steady and grounded as the stone foundations of the house. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, his jet-black hair neatly styled, his dark eyes watching the two women with a quiet, protective pride. He had stayed through the night, coordinating the legal teams and the cleanup crews, ensuring that the transition of the $500 million contract back into the Brooks name was seamless and absolute. "It's time," Yana whispered, her voice steady and clear. She walked to the family portrait, her fingers moving to the silver locket her mother wore in the painting. She pressed her thumb to the hidden sensor, and the blue light of the biometric scanner hummed to life. For the first time, she didn't feel like a hunted animal hiding a secret. She felt like a daughter claiming her birthright. With a soft hiss of air, the oak paneling slid back, revealing the hidden console and the silver drives. Yana reached inside, but instead of the digital ledgers, she picked up the small, handwritten envelope she had seen nights before. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. Inside were 2 letters, one for Patricia and one for her. As she read her father's elegant script, Samuel's voice seemed to fill the room, warm and resonant. He had known the risks of his world. He had known that men like Edward existed in the cracks of the corporate empire. The letter wasn't about the money. It was about the strength he knew his daughter possessed. "The contract is a tool, Yana," the letter read. "But you are the legacy. Never let the world tell you that your kindness is a weakness. Build something that matters, and choose people who will stand by you not for what you have, but for who you are." Yana folded the paper, a single tear tracking down her dark brown skin, but her lips were curved into a smile of profound resolution. She looked at the $500 million contract, the crown jewel that had cost so much blood, and realized it was no longer a curse. It was the foundation of the new empire she was going to build. She turned to Junseok, who was watching the city skyline from the window. He looked like a man ready to fade back into the shadows of the underworld, his job finished, the debt paid. The Ghost King was a man of transitions, a man who moved from one war to the next, but Anna knew she couldn't let him walk away. "You're leaving?" she asked, stepping toward him. Junseok paused, his sharp facial features softening as he looked at her. "The threat is gone, Anna. Your mother is safe. And the legal path is clear. My world is not a place for someone like you." "My world was destroyed by a man I thought was family," Yana said, her almond-shaped eyes fixed on his with an intensity that made him stop. "And it was saved by a man the world calls a monster. My father told me to choose people who would stand by me. I'm choosing you." She walked closer, stopping just a few feet away. "I have an empire to run, and my mother has a life to reclaim. We need more than just a lawyer or a bodyguard. We need the man who saw a girl in a gray hoodie and chose honor over easy gold." Junseok looked at her for a long, silent moment. He saw the transformation in her, the way the fear had been replaced by a quiet, commanding authority. She was no longer the fugitive who had jumped into his car. She was a woman who was ready to lead. In her, he saw a chance for his own redemption, a way to use his power for something other than the cold maintenance of the streets. "I am a man of the shadows, Yana," he warned, though his voice lacked its usual icy edge. "My name carries a weight that doesn't belong in boardrooms." "Then we'll change the weight of the name," Yana replied. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her palm resting near the tattoo on his neck. "Stay, not just as the Ghost King, but as a partner, as the family we have left." Junseok looked down at her hand, then back at Patricia, who gave him a small, welcoming nod. For the first time in his life, the man who commanded thousands felt like he had found a home. He reached out and covered her hand with his, a silent pact being sealed in the sunlight of the library. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. The Brooks legacy was no longer a story of betrayal and blood. It was a new empire, built on the resilience of a daughter, the strength of a mother, and the ironclad honor of a man from the shadows. As Anna looked out at the New York skyline, she knew the journey ahead would be long, but she wasn't running anymore. She was standing tall, flanked by her mother and the most dangerous man in the city, ready to show the world that the Brooks name was more powerful than ever. The fire had passed, and what remained was unbreakable. In a world of betrayal, Sometimes the most dangerous man in the city is the only one you can truly trust. Anna Brooks lost a father, but she gained an empire and a protector the world will never forget. Thank you for watching Afro-Sial Mafia stories. If this story moved you, leave a comment below with the word legacy so I know you made it to the end. I'll see you in the next chapter, where the shadows always have a story to tell. Stay safe, stay strong, and I'll catch you in the next one.